Welcome to this SBP online training module on Standard 6, version 2.1. Standard 6 covers energy and carbon balance calculations within the SBP certification scheme. In this session, we will explain why SBP gathers greenhouse gas data, walk through the calculation methodology at a high level, and place the document within the wider v2.1 update of the SBP standards. By the end of this module, you will be able to do 5 things. Explain why SBP requires GHG calculations. Describe the GHG calculation equation and its components. Identify where activity data comes from in the SBP system, in the SAR, the SREG, and the data transfer system. Place SBP Standard 6v2.1 in the broader v2.1 update of the standards. And recognize the role of the two instruction documents that support Standard 6, Instruction Document EU Red and Instruction Document Japan. Why do SBP certificate holders calculate greenhouse gas emissions at all? 3 reasons. First, regulatory compliance. End users in the EU under the Renewable Energy Directive, in the United Kingdom, in Japan under the feed-in tariff scheme, and in other markets are required to report verified GHG savings. Second, climate integrity. A claim that biomass is legally and sustainably sourced is strengthened when emissions are quantified across the life cycle and compared to a fossil fuel comparator. And third, market access. Verified GHG data underpins trade with mandatory reporting markets. A critical point, SBP itself does not run the calculation. The SBP system supplies the verified activity data that end users need, so they can perform the calculation themselves. Every operator upstream of the end user contributes inputs through the SBP data transfer system. A few foundational principles before we go further. Greenhouse gases are plural, carbon dioxide is the most important, but methane and nitrous oxide also have to be accounted for. We do not measure these at the stack or tailpipe. They are calculated from activity data, how much fuel was burned, how much fertilizer was applied, multiplied by emission factors. The final result is always expressed as grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of biomass fuel. The little e means equivalent. Methane and nitrous oxide are converted into CO2 equivalent terms using their global warming potential. The Renewable Energy Directive specifies the GWP values to use, and we'll come back to those later. And one practical reminder that catches people out is conversion between units, kilowatt hours versus megajoules, short tons versus metric tons. These mistakes are easy to make and easy to spot in audit. Wood biomass can substitute for fossil fuels because the CO2 released when wood is burned is the same CO2 the tree absorbed during growth. So at the point of combustion, biomass is treated as carbon neutral. This is only valid when the forest carbon stocks are stable or increasing over the long term, which is exactly what Standard 1 of the SBP system ensures. If the supply base meets that condition, the biomass at combustion has 0 carbon emissions, and we can set the stock change term in the equation to 0. Standard 1, criterion 3.2, is the criterion that delivers this guarantee. It requires that carbon stocks in the forest area of the supply base are stable or increasing in the long term. This is why we can, with integrity, treat biomass combustion as 0 rated for CO2. Without this guarantee, the whole logic of substituting fossil fuel with biomass would not hold. Behind every GRAM CO2 number you'll see in this training is the assurance that comes from Standard 1. Now we look at where emissions actually occur in the supply chain. There are emissions at every stage: cultivation and harvesting, transport of feedstock to the mill, processing into pellets or chips, transport of the finished product, and end use. Each of the 6 SBP standards covers one or more of these stages. Standard 1 covers the forest. Standard 2 covers the supply base evaluation. Standards 4 and 5 cover the chain of custody and data collection. Standard 6, the one we're focused on today, is where all that data is turned into a carbon number. The data transfer between actors flows through the SBP data transfer system. One key thing to remember from the previous slides is the forest carbon stock indicator only guarantees the CO2 balances across the supply chain, not the methane or nitrous oxide. They still need to be calculated when the biomass is burned. This is the equation from Annex 6 Part B of the EU Renewable Energy Directive, and it's the same equation used in Instruction Document 6D for EU ED. Total emissions equal emissions from extraction or cultivation, plus land use change, plus processing, plus transport and distribution, plus emissions from the fuel in use, minus savings from soil carbon accumulation, minus savings from CO2 capture and geological storage, minus savings from CO2 capture and under SBP, 4 of the savings terms default to 0. There is no soil carbon credit available, and CCS and CCR are not yet operationally in scope, and land use. So in practice, you calculate 4 positive terms: extraction and cultivation, processing and transport, plus the small generation non-CO2 gases. This matrix shows you which fuels typically appear at which stage of the life cycle. Diesel for cultivation and road transport, heavy fuel oil for marine transport, natural gas, propane, LPG for processing, electricity at processing and possibly cultivation, as well as electric trains in some countries. Biomass fuels at processing, particularly for drying. You only track what's relevant to your actual operation, but you should be able to look at this table and tick off your own activity data sources. Operators have a choice when calculating each term. You can calculate actual values from your own measured verifiable data. These usually give a lower emissions number, but they take effort, and the certification body has to verify them. Or you can use default factors, values published in the Renewable Energy Directive Annex 6 for specific production pathways. Defaults are simple and easily verified, but they are deliberately conservative, meaning they tend to give higher emission numbers. There's also a middle option called disaggregated defaults, where you mix actual values for some parts of the supply chain with defaults for others. We'll come back to this choice later. A note specifically on electricity, because it trips people up. If your installation draws electricity from the grid, you can use either a national emission factor or a location-specific one, depending on what's available. Factors are often published by national grid operators or appear directly on your electricity invoice. Be careful with units. Invoices typically show kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, but the calculation uses grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule, so a conversion is needed. If your operator has on-site renewable generation, say wind or solar, that electricity can be counted as zero, but only if there is no feed-in connection back to the grid. If there is a feed-in connection to the grid, the emission factor must be the grid factor. Now to Standard 6 itself. Standard 6 is designed primarily for end users, the operator that converts biomass into electricity or heat, but it can also be used by upstream operators when regional regulators require it. The 4 operational principles are clauses 2.1 to 2.4. 2.1 says, calculations must be done in compliance with the relevant SBP instruction document. 2.2 says, where the market sets a savings requirement, you must use the methodology in the relevant instruction document, and either an SBP approved or a nationally approved calculator. 2.3 says aggregated data passed to SBP must be in grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And 2.4 says, when the end user reports savings to SBP, they shall report the percentage savings against the applicable reference. 4 sentences, that is the entirety of Standard 6 operational text. All 6 SBP standards have been updated from version 2.0 to version 2.1. Some standards received substantive revisions. Standard 6 did not. Its text and clauses are unchanged from v2.0. The version 2.1 dates are approved 25th of February 2026, published 29th of April 2026, and effective from 29th of July 2026. The transition period for the wider standards update runs to 28th of October 2027, and the next review of the standards is scheduled for 16th of March 2028. If you want to see what changed in the other standards, please refer to the SBP website where the changelog is published alongside each document. So far in this module, we've said something important. SBP gathers and verifies the activity data, but the actual GHG calculation is done by the end user. That's about to get a lot easier. SBP is about to publish a tool we've been working on for some time, the SBP GHG Calculator. It's not live yet, but it's close, and you'll start hearing more about it through the official channels in the coming weeks. The idea is simple. You already have the SAR and where it applies the SREG. Both of these can be downloaded from the DTS. You feed the SAR into the calculator, and the calculator gives you the emissions number and your savings percentage versus the regulatory threshold. Nothing about the data sources changes. Nothing about Standard 6 changes. What changes is that the calculation step, which today every end user does on their own, will have an SBP approved tool behind it. A few practical things to know. It's an Excel workbook. It uses VBA macros, so when you open it, you'll be asked to enable macros. It reads the activity data straight out of the SAR, applies the SBP approved methodology, and outputs the emissions and the savings percentage, minimizing human error. When SBP publishes it, you'll get the calculator workbook itself, a step-by-step user guide, and an updated default value library. So the disaggregated defaults you saw earlier in this module will be built into the tool. It's designed to work with the current SAR template, so the link between the audit report and the calculation is preserved. There will also be a separate training module dedicated to the calculator with a worked example end-to-end. So if you're sitting there thinking this is great, but how do I actually do the calculation? The short answer is today, you follow the instruction document. Soon, you'll have the calculator and a training module to go with it. Watch this space. Standard 6 sits alongside two instruction documents that hold the technical methodology. The instruction document 6D for EU RED is built around the EU Renewable Energy Directive. It is the document you use if your biomass goes into an EU market. The instruction document Japan is based on Japanese FIT regulation. It uses the same overall methodology, but with Japanese default values and Japanese threshold percentages. Use the document that matches the destination market for your biomass. Both documents are available on the SBP website. Other markets may follow as SBP expands its scope. This slide shows where each life cycle stage of the biomass pellet draws its data from within the SBP framework. Each stage on the chevron strip maps to a specific source form completed during the audit. Cultivation data sits in section 2.2 of the SAR, the SBP audit report, covering energy and chemicals used in the forest during growing and harvesting. Feedstock transport data sits in section 2.1 of the SAR, covering the feedstock groups and how raw material is moved from the forest to the gate of the processing site. Processing data sits in section 3 of the SAR, covering biomass production at the pellet mill, including energy inputs and process emissions. Product transport. This is the only stage that draws on two sources. Section 4 of the SAR covers the gate to port leg, and the SREG, the supply region evaluation, covers both inland and sea transport from port onward to the end user. Generation. This stage is in scope for Standard 6, but is not captured in the SAR or SREG. Instead, the data is collected directly by the end user on site, since combustion conditions and efficiency are specific to each generating facility. The italic line at the bottom signposts the next slide, which breaks down what each form actually contains. Cultivation data is in section 2.2 of the SAR, the SBP audit report. Feedstock transport data is in section 2.1. Processing data is in section 3. Product transport data is in section 4 of the SAR for the dispatch side, and in the SREG, the shipment register for the per shipment detail. End-use data is supplied by the end user themselves. The point is, if your upstream chain is properly certified to Standard 5, All the inputs your calculation needs are already collected and verified. You are not starting from scratch. Stage 1 is extraction and cultivation. The most important data you need is diesel consumption in liters per hectare per year. If your feedstock comes from a plantation rather than a managed natural forest, fertilizer inputs in kilograms per hectare per year, broken down by P2O5, K2O calcium oxide, and mineral and organic nitrogen, electricity consumption in kilowatt hours per hectare per year, seed inputs, and any chemicals applied. For most natural forest harvesting operations, fertilizer is not used and only diesel for the harvesters is significant. Stage 2 is feedstock transportation, the movement of raw material from forest to mill. The data points are fuel type, which depends on the vehicle, diesel for trucks, diesel or electricity for trains, average and maximum distance in kilometers, vehicle load in metric tons, moisture of the wet raw material, the wet raw mass moved, and critically the backhaul attribution, a number between 0.5 and 1 that captures how much of the return journey is loaded. If the truck returns empty, the backhaul factor is 0.5, which effectively doubles your emissions per loaded ton. Note that the backhaul factor isn't currently in the SAR, you supply it separately. A backhaul of 1 means the vehicle returns fully loaded. Stage 3 is processing. The pellet or chip mill itself, this is usually the largest emission term. You report your operator energy, which heat configuration applies, natural gas boiler with grid electricity, wood chip boiler with grid electricity, or an on-site combined heat and power plant. The annual quantity of each fossil fuel, natural gas, diesel, gasoline, propane, and LPG. The annual quantity of each biomass fuel, bark, diverted product, forest residues used for drying or for the CHP, the annual product output and average lower heating value, and the moisture content of inputs and outputs. The chosen heat configuration determines which Annex D6 default value, if you use a default, applies. Stage 4 is product transport, moving the finished pellets or chips from the mill to the end user. There are halves, inland and sea. For inland transport, you need vehicle type, truck, train, or barge, mass moved, distance in kilometers, and backhaul. For sea transport, you need vessel type, Supramax, Handysize, Panamax, mass, distance in nautical miles, the cargo, and the backhaul factor. For sea transport, the default backhaul factor recommended by the European Commission's Joint Research Center is 0.7%, meaning 70% of the return journey is treated as loaded. Stage 5 is end use, what the end user does with the biomass. The data points are the type of installation, pure electricity, pure heat, or combined heat and power. The principal purpose, if it's CHP, and the fossil fuel comparator. The Renewable Energy Directive sets these comparators: 183 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule for electricity and 80 grams CO2 equivalent for heat, except where the heat is shown to directly substitute for coal, in which case it's 124. Then comes the savings requirement. The table below shows the EU RED thresholds. Installations starting after the 20th of November 2023 must achieve at least 80% savings immediately. Installations from January 2021 to November 2023 must achieve 70% until end of 2029, then 80%. And installations operating before January 2021 must achieve 80% after 15 years of operation. The Japan thresholds are in the instruction document Japan. 5 things to take away. SBP gathers verified activity data. The end user performs the calculation. Standard 6 itself is unchanged in v2.1, but Standard 6 v2.1 becomes effective on the 29th of July 2026 alongside the rest of the v2.1 update. All the data you need to run the calculation is already in the SAR, the SREG, and the data transfer system. For every term in the equation, the user can choose actual values, default values, or disaggregated default values. And finally, the end user compares the total to the fossil fuel comparator and reports the savings percentage against the regulatory threshold for their market. A separate online module covering worked GHG calculation examples will follow. Thank you for completing this module on SBP Standard 6. All the documents referenced in this session, Standard 6, the instruction document EU Red, the instruction document Japan, and the related standards are available on our website. For questions, please contact us via email.